Do you find the process of eating healthy to be a little daunting, a little boring? Sometimes the more you know, the less you know. You start eating one way only to learn you're doing it all wrong. Well, welcome to Ken Cook is having another episode. And today's episode is all about the food we put into our bodies and all the decisions we make before that even happens. I'm a huge fan of today's guest, nutritionist Courtney Swan. She's the proprietor of Realfoodology, and she's on a mission to educate people about America's very broken food system. Courtney understands that food activists come from all paths of life and all perspectives. And I was lucky enough to be on her podcast recently, Realfoodology, a must listen. And during that conversation, we talked about how our corrupt food industry makes us sicker and how legal doesn't always mean safe, a common theme here on the episodes we have. So today isn't about turning everyone vegan or making you give up foods you love. Rather, it's about understanding what you're putting into your body and how you can have more agency within a broken food system. The older we get, the more likely it is that we'll become a caregiver of some sort. And it's easier than you might think to provide the people we love and ourselves with nutritious, healthy, delicious food. So let's dig in. I'm really pleased to have you here today, Courtney. Before we started, we joked that maybe we're two people that should never be invited to a dinner party because everyone feels like we're so judgy about food. I have that in my circle of friends. Actually, I've lost all those friends. Now only strangers will eat with me because they don't really know. But welcome. It's so great to have you on. I'm such a big fan of your take on the food system and how you've given people great tools to take charge of their diet, their nutrition, and their health.
Thank you so much for having me on. And it was such a pleasure to have you on my podcast recently. It was very well received, and it was just a great episode because you are so well versed in what's happening right now with our food system as well. And it's important that people know what's really happening behind the scenes.
Absolutely. So how did you decide that you were going to devote yourself to this messy set of issues we call eating?
Well, it all started with my mom. So I am very blessed to have grown up in a household where every meal was made from scratch, pretty much. We rarely ate out. I very rarely had fast food growing up. We really didn't have any ultra processed foods. It was pretty rare. And my mom was the one that was really spearheading all of that. She had gotten super into nutrition when she was living in Boulder before she had had me. So I had grown up really not knowing how good I had it. And I moved away to Colorado for college and started to gain weight, feel really lethargic. I just was not feeling good in my body. I started breaking out with acne in my face that I had never had before. Just all these little things started happening. And I started to connect with what I was putting in my body with what was happening. So I kind of had this backwards thing. I think a lot of people initially get into the health world because it comes out of this desperation because they're sick, they get diagnosed with some sort of disease or whatever it is. And for me, it was vice versa. I had grown up feeling really good in my body. And then when I went to college, I started eating, in the cafeteria in the dorm room and having the fourth meal at Taco Bell. While I was trying to connect the dots, my mom had started mailing me stuff physically in the mail. I remember she would cut out little newspaper clippings. She sent me an article on trans fats, otherwise known as hydrogenated oils. And this was 2005. My mom was really on top of it. And it just really started to spark an interest for me. And so I decided to take a nutrition class, and this was in my undergrad. And this was one of the last classes I took for my undergrad. And I remember I had really struggled to figure out exactly what I wanted to do as far as a career. And when I took this last class, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. Like nutrition, it really sparked a passion in me. And I remember my dad was like, no, we're done with school. You've already done 4 years. Like, we'll figure something else out. Like jokingly. And then, of course, I ended up in a career of working in music. During that time frame, I had gotten so into health. I started finding the works of Michael Pollan, Dr. Josh Axe, Mark Hyman, Vani Hari, the Food Babe. And I got so passionate and excited about it that I decided that I wanted to go back to school and get my master's. And so then I went back to school, got my master's in nutrition. And around the same time, I started to really dive into what was actually happening with our food system. I'm the personality where I'm always diving for the truth, and I get very upset when I feel like people are being lied to. And this was an instant where I realized that so many people were in the dark about what was really happening with our food system, and it just felt so wrong to me that I wanted to speak out about it. So I started speaking out about it. I created Realfoodology while I was getting my master's, and that's how it all started.
Well, Realfoodology is a treasure. And you have some other resources too. One of the questions that always comes up in everyone's life if they're starting to focus on food is what do you do when you eat out? And you have a guide to help people find restaurants that are not bad for you.
Yeah. When I was working in music, I found myself in a different city every day because I was working with bands and I was on the road with them. And this was around the time when I was starting to get really into health and nutrition. And I was actually helping the bands I was on the road with. One of them, I ended up on the road with her as her nutritionist for 4 years. And during that time frame, what I would do is every city we were in, I would wake up and I would find really healthy restaurants. And then I started putting them on my website because other people started asking me all the time, oh my gosh, I'm going to Austin. What places
Ah,
do you recommend? And so then I created this whole
yeah.
resource for people to go. And then when I started traveling overseas, then I had all these restaurants overseas. And so I have this whole resource of places you can go that are healthier.
That's so important. We have an outdated version on our website that we sort of inherited from another organization and we've been meaning to update it too. Maybe we should
We should collab on
put
that.
our heads together and see if we can do that because people, really do want to encourage these kinds of businesses that are taking a leap beyond the normal and, not just having a food service truck pull in with all the supplies, right? Which they then put on the menu as food and they're not really.
And to speak to that, actually, so I recently, for my Instagram, I did a series where I walked into a restaurant depot, which is where a lot of these restaurants are sourcing their ingredients. And I was horrified. I did a bunch of videos on my Instagram because the products, I wouldn't even call them food, the products that were in there that restaurants are going in to source their meals from were horrendous, like reconstituting mashed potatoes, for example. And it was like a bag of flakes and it had all these oils and
Oh,
stabilizers and
God.
emulsifiers. And nothing in there was really food. And then there was a bunch of stuff in the frozen section where restaurants are just dumping them into a fryer. And also these fryers, they're
Yeah.
not cleaning them
Yeah.
out and they're reheating up that horrible oil for months before they switch it out. And it's just wreaking havoc on our cardiovascular system. And so I encourage people to go back and watch those videos. And another organization that I know called Seed Oil Scout, and they have an app where you can go on and look up what restaurants are not
Mhm.
using seed oils. They actually did a series as well. So if people want to go back and see what kind of food like products these restaurants are sourcing, I would encourage them to because a lot of these restaurants are not using real food anymore.
Yeah. And yet they're calling it food. I mean, you must get pushback from the kinds of things that you're covering, the kinds of issues that you're disclosing. It does cut against the grain. It cuts against big companies. It cuts against restaurant chains. It's a lot to go up against. What have you noticed over the years since you got engaged with this that has changed? Has it gotten easier? Is there more receptivity? Or has the pushback gotten more sophisticated and sharper? Is it a combination?
It is. It's a combination. I will say that the pushback has gotten a lot harder, but it's gotten easier for me just because I think I've gotten so much hate that I've kind of become immune to it almost at this point. I've talked about this a couple times on some podcasts because I was really taken back by this. So I started posting about this online in 2011. And it was back when I was getting my master's and I was so excited. I was posting recipes, I was posting information where I was just telling people, like, I've been learning this and I feel like everybody needs to know. And back then, up until probably about 2017, maybe 2018, it was pretty much for the most part really well received. I would get a lot of people saying, "Oh my gosh, I
Hmm.
didn't know. Thank you so much for sharing this. Like, wow, I'm so shocked. I'm going to change the ways I do this." And, it was pretty well received. Something shifted around, I would say 2019 and then really into 2020 where there was a lot of like vitriol, like there was a lot of anger behind it, a lot of pushback. And I periodically will go on my Instagram and just try to remind people like, look, I'm just the messenger here. I'm not the one that's creating these products. I'm not the one that's putting these policies in place. I'm not in charge of the FDA. I'm not in charge of the government. Like all really common
Yeah.
sense things, right? But for some reason, people have decided to take their anger out on these companies on me. And I'm just the messenger here. But I will say it's gotten easier for me in the sense that, like I said, I've gotten so immune to it that I just kind of tune it out because I feel as though I need to put my blinders on because I'm very clear on my mission and what I'm here to do. And I don't want anybody to deter me from that because I know that that what's happening right now is wrong. And I want people to know, and I don't want anybody to deter me from that. So I'm just like, okay, hate is just part of the process right now for whatever reason.
Yeah, I'm sure you're aware that EWG is on the receiving end of
I'm sure.
that kind of thing all the time. But this has become sort of a corner of the culture
Mhm.
war in some ways. It's not always divided along the lines that other aspects of the culture war is divided, but there is a sense that, hey, we're out here trying to make a living. We're selling this food. It's perfectly healthy. The government has approved it. It's not, there's nothing illegal about it. And that becomes a standard. At the other end of the continuum, we find, I'd be curious to know if you have found this too, people from the left and the right who don't trust the government for their own reasons. Maybe they don't feel the government's doing enough, or maybe the government should just get out of everyone's business. Doesn't really matter. But they come to rely on EWG, and I think probably rely on you for practical advice. What can I do? I want to have my own agency here and utilize it to the max. And oftentimes, those are the folks who get upset when we step into policy issues because they're like, wait a minute, you're just here to give advice. Now you're criticizing the FDA, you're criticizing pesticides, you're criticizing food companies that are putting things in food. You shouldn't step into the policy fight. You should just continue to give us advice for what we can do in our daily lives, what we can do for our families. That came about really, frankly, after the 2016
Mhm.
election in a big way for us because people thought, well, you don't do policy, do you? You're just giving us the dirty dozen, the clean 15, the shopper's guide. Why are you messing with politics and criticizing our hero, President Trump? Is that a dynamic you've experienced as well?
Yeah, and it's interesting because like you said, I see it from both sides. I was laughing about this with friends all throughout the pandemic because I would get messages from both sides of people just as I'm just sharing about the food. I wasn't even talking about any president. I wasn't talking about anything specific.
Yeah.
And I would just say something about maybe I was talking about like immune health and like we should get vitamin D from the sunlight to help spark our immune systems. And I would get messages from both sides and people being like, "Oh my god, I can't believe you're a Trumper." And then I'd get like, "Oh my god, I can't believe that you're, a far leftist." And I was so
Yeah.
confused by it because I was like, "How are we making
Yeah.
this about party lines? This is about humanity." Like it has nothing to do with who
Yeah.
like I was not even talking about who I was voting for. It was just yeah. It is very interesting to see that.
Yeah. But the food system in particular, there seems to be a real pushback I've noticed over the same time period you're talking about. And my feeling is that it's because the threat has gotten more serious and that the reaction, including paid reactions online where people are hired to harass people like you and organizations like EWG, I think that's become more of a reality. But I want to believe, and I think there's some evidence for it, that the good food movement has grown. It's become more threatening. And so the pushback is a little harsher, a little sharper. Do you think there's something to that? Because it's a different world than when you started in 2011. You have agency and take action, more choices, right?
Yeah, and and I will say I think what has happened, I don't know if it was just that I became more aware or if there really has been a bigger shift as far as like into politics, but when I started in 2011, I really didn't have any sort of passion or even a lot of education to be honest around politics. I really wasn't that involved. And over the years, as
Yeah.
our food system has become worse and as things have become more dire, and as I've started realizing all the different connections to our government and to our policies and everything going on, it just started naturally happening that I started getting more involved in politics. And I think maybe that's just been the natural progression of it. I was talking about this the other day that I think a lot
Yeah.
of people still have not made this connection, but what we're dealing with right now as a whole, as a country, our health is at the forefront of all of this. And you think about, like, for example, everybody's really concerned about climate change and the planet heating up for a really good reason. We all should be concerned about it. But when you look at the way that we're farming traditionally, conventionally right now, we're destroying the soil. And as a result, the soil being destroyed, it's not able to do its natural carbon sequestration in the form of, and what we should be doing is regenerative farming. So it's having an effect on our climate, the way that we're farming right now. And then also on top of that, our healthcare is through the freaking roof. I mean, we're trillions in debt now with our healthcare.
Yeah.
And because we have a really sick population, our population is only about 93% metabolically healthy right now. And it's because we're not eating well. And so you think about like all the issues. And then on top of that, everybody's talking about mental health issues right now. A lot of people are really struggling right now. Again, that comes back
Yeah.
to our food. It comes back to our guts. If we're not eating real food and we're eating a bunch of chemicals, it's going to have an effect on our brain. And so I think it's just naturally become more political because a lot of what's happening in our food system, unfortunately, is being allowed because of the policies that we have that are in place. And then we have certain organizations like the FDA that are just not regulating as much as they should be with our food system. And so I think it's just become naturally more heated and political.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, we've stepped into the ingredient fight in the food system in recent years, and it was hard for people to understand. It's the same with personal care, same with cleaning products. You can pretty much put anything in food. It's largely a self-regulated industry, processed food, and the benefit of a lot of these ingredients is not the consumer, to say the least. It's really the convenience of the companies. It's preservatives, it's colorants. They're cheaper than eating natural, real food in many cases and require less time. You can pop something in the microwave. All of those forces, there's a regulatory, there's a policy realm that is allowing that to happen. When you push back against it, you really feel it from these big food companies and people who make the ingredients, and the whole system recoils. Their immune system kicks in, right? They push back at the idea that there's anything wrong at all. And so someone comes along like you who's, really from the bottom up, you're saying, I'm just starting as a nutritionist. Let's start with what's most healthy rather than your shopping cart and what's bad in it. Let's build it up that way. Which brings me to my question. When someone wants to get started with healthy eating, where do you start them, Court? Where do you start them?
Yeah, I would say the first conversation is just becoming aware of all of the ultra processed foods that you have in your pantry. There's a lot of confusion about what healthy eating truly means. And I have a lot of empathy for people that are in that place because I was once there too. And I was searching for answers. And my first thought was, okay, I'm going to go to all the diet foods. And this, in my time, I don't even know if they still make them, but it was like Slim Fast bars and, the Slim Fast drinks and all this stuff that are marketed to us,
Yes.
right? Like the lean cuisines, the frozen processed lean cuisines. And at the time, I didn't really have any education around it. And so I fell for the marketing.
You thought that was your route to health.
Exactly. And that's a really big problem. And a lot of people
Yeah.
are unfortunately getting duped by this, and it's not their fault. I mean, these companies have massive $1 million ad budgets behind them to make us think that they're healthy.
Yeah.
Because we haven't been educated on what it truly means to be healthy and what we should be eating. And so I always tell people, let's just start with the real basics. Let's get back to eating real food. Now, what is real food? It's food in its most whole natural state. And I'm also a realist, so I don't expect everyone to just, live off the land, grow a garden in their backyard. I mean, that would be amazing. And I'm so for it. But I know it's really hard for a lot of people. And it's also not realistic that people are never going to buy things in packages. So what I tell them is when you go to the grocery store and when you need some packaged foods, look at the back of that ingredient list. And if you could technically buy every single ingredient on that package in the grocery store, then that would be a packaged food that I would say would be safe and okay to buy. Perfect example, I think of like Simple Mills products. When you look at the back of their package, I mean, they use rosemary as a preservative. You know where you can buy rosemary in the grocery store. But if you pick up something like a Cheez-Its and it has a BHT ingredient in there, which is I always forget if it's an emulsifier or a preservative. But I do know that BHT is linked to colon cancer. It's a really big concern. There's a bunch of studies linking it. And again, where are you going to source BHT in the grocery store? You're going to go, I don't even know where I would find that. Where do I buy that?
At a chemical plant.
Exactly.
A refinery.
A refinery.
That's a great way to think about it. I had not thought about it that way. Food is made of food. If you can't find it in the grocery store, I love that idea. So tell me about your nutrition, your diet. What's a day of eating for Courtney Swan?
So I like to keep mine really interesting. I learned pretty quickly that I can't eat the same thing every day. I just can't. I get really bored with it. and I need a really big variety. So what I normally do, my favorite thing to do is on like a Sunday, I'll open up one of my favorite cookbooks, or sometimes I'll just go to like one of my favorite Instagram pages. There's a bunch of really amazing recipe developers that I follow, and I'll pick maybe like
Uh-huh.
3 or 4 recipes that sound really good for that week. And then what's cool about that is I'll write down the recipes, and then what I end up finding is that a lot of them will have an overlap of like different ingredients. And so then I'll go to the grocery store or I'll go to the farmer's market, and let's say that like one recipe calls for tomatoes and then another one also calls for tomatoes. Then I can use that to also make the other recipe. And what I like to do is I'll meal prep a lot of stuff. And I remind people this all the time. I think there's this misconception that eating healthy means that you're just going to be eating bland chicken with no spices and broccoli and rice cakes. You know, it's like everybody knows those bodybuilders that just eat the bland chicken all day and the
Yeah.
broccoli.
Yeah.
I can't do that. And I'm here to tell you that you don't have to do that to be healthy. I eat the most wonderful, amazing, flavorful dishes. I have a rule in my house that, like, if it doesn't taste good, we're not going to force it down. That's just not what we do.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
there's this misconception that eating healthy is really boring and it doesn't taste good. But I use an array of spices. One of my favorite things I love to do is if there's a food that I really love that's quote unquote considered unhealthy, let's take, for example, burgers or pizza. I'm not going to deprive myself of that, but I'm going to make it at home. I get really good grass fed beef. I get a really good either sourdough or gluten free bun, or sometimes I'll just wrap it in lettuce, and I'll make the sweet potato fries or the regular fries from home. It's so simple. All you need is an oven at like 400 degrees. You put it with either olive oil or avocado oil, some salt, cut them up like potato slices, and they taste almost exactly the same as French fries. And you don't need to deny yourself of that. The issue is that if we're going to McDonald's or we're buying these, frozen things in the frozen food section, they're going to have the BHT, the, mono and diglycerides, and just all the
Yeah.
stuff that you don't want to be putting in your body.
Yeah. So what's your view on meat? You obviously eat meat. What's your take on that?
Okay, so I will tell you that when I first started getting into health, I was vegetarian for 5 years.
And the joke is, how do you know someone's a
They'll tell you
vegetarian?
about
Because
it.
they tell you.
They tell you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
that so much.
Of course.
And at the time, you know what? It was really what I needed. In the beginning, I felt so amazing. I had so much energy and I felt really good, and it served me for 5 years. And in that time frame, I never craved meat. I never felt deprived of it, and it really was amazing. I hit a point that last year where I broke out in really, really aggressive cystic acne that I could not get rid of. I was
Huh.
hormonally imbalanced. I had been more fatigued than I'd ever been in my life. And when I first went vegetarian, I had lost a bunch of weight. And then by the end of it, I had gained probably 20 pounds, and I felt starving all the time. Now, the kicker was, and this was kind of the end for me, I started having dreams about meat, and I was dreaming about it every night, literally every single night. And
In what form did the meat come? Like a burger
it was a
on a
burger,
plate,
and then I
or
kept having dreams. Actually, I will never forget this, and I tell this story all the time. I woke up in the middle of the night one time air feeding myself chicken nuggets. I woke up and I was like,
oh, get out.
"What?" It was crazy. And I remember my mom sat me down and she goes, "Courtney, I think this is your body telling you that you really need meat." And fast forward to now, it's really interesting. I've been doing a lot of blood work and gut tests and all this stuff recently, and I did something called the nutrition genome. And my doctor sat me down and she goes, "It's interesting that you had that experience with vegetarianism, because according to your genetics and certain detoxification pathways, your body actually needs meat." And this is my whole
Mhm.
thing is I believe that some bodies are inherently built to be vegetarian and I think some aren't. And my biggest talking point around all this, when I decided to go back eating meat, I cried about it. I was absolutely devastated. I had read many books about factory farming and the horrible way that we're treating the animals in
Yeah.
this country. And
Yeah.
it's absolutely
Yeah.
heartbreaking. And honestly, it should be illegal. And so, my biggest talking point around this is if you do decide to eat meat, buy organic, regenerative meat where you know that they're coming from a good place. You know that they're living out on pastures. They're living a good life. They were taken care of. They're not, living in these horrible living conditions in factory farming. And so that's my biggest thing
Yeah.
is that if you are going to eat meat, we need to be very conscious about the way we're doing it, because with factory farming, that is contributing to climate change, and it's also contributing to an awful life for these animals.
That's what moved me away from meat a few years ago. Now, more recently, and my wife and I have talked about it, I have also found myself wanting to eat like once or twice a week. I'll eat chicken or something. Before that, I was eating fish, but those are animals too. for me, the big motivator was animal welfare more than climate. I have the same feelings that you do. For me, at least, meat is going to be an occasional treat kind of thing as opposed to something that I'm consuming every day. And I try and buy responsibly grown meat.
Yeah, I think it's on all of us to put our money into companies that we know are taking care of these animals because something needs to be done about the factory farming. And not only that, like I will tell people too that if you are eating animals that come from factory farming settings, you're eating sick animals. You just are. Like they're not healthy.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to be good for us either, you know? And I think that's where a lot of the connection comes from. There's a lot of studies connecting cancer to red meat consumption. And I believe that it's the way that they're
Yep.
raising the meat.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. Certainly highly processed meats,
Yeah.
that's the case with respect to cancer risk. It's
100%.
very much enhanced. So as you think about the way the food system is performing now and what's ahead, what do you think are the main battlefronts for solving some of these big problems? We've just talked a little bit about meat and just trying to eat more responsibly grown meat, whether it's organic or free range. Obviously, it's sometimes those terms don't have the integrity we would
Yes.
like. But what do you see as from a policy standpoint, and what do you see from a personal standpoint? What do you think some of the big fights are ahead of us?
Oh man, I'm like, where do I start? Because there's so many of them. I would say, I think the biggest issue that we're having right now is that there's 11 corporations that own the entirety of our food system right now. And that means that they have a lot of money and they have a lot of control. They have a lot of politicians in their back pockets. They have a lot of policies that are in their favor. Right now, what's happening with these food manufacturers and with the FDA is that if they want to introduce a new chemical, a new lab made, whatever it is, emulsifier, you name it, preservative, all they have to do is this company that wants to use it prove to the FDA that it's generally recognized as safe. And that's about
Yeah.
as far as it goes. So I think a lot of people think that just because it's on the shelf and that it's legal, that it's healthy and it's good for you. And it's really not. We have the foxes guarding the hen house right now. So I think
Yeah.
that is probably the biggest hurdle we have because we're kind of at this standstill where these companies are making so much money that they obviously don't want to let go. How do we get in and how do we fix that? Because we need
Yeah.
the policies to change. And this is why I started this whole movement. I think at least part of the change has to come from the ground up. It has to be the consumers.
I
It
agree.
has to be us
Yeah.
demanding better. And it has to be that we stop buying these food like products and we start buying the healthier for you products. I look at just the way that organic has grown from when I started in 2011 to now. That has mostly been driven by consumer trends and by more people buying organic.
Totally.
So I would say that I think is our biggest one. Also, the factory farming one, I think is a really tough one. I'm very personally and passionately invested in the regenerative farming movement. I encourage anybody listening, if they want to educate themselves on it, go and watch Kiss the Ground on Netflix. That was really what sparked my interest in it. And then they have a newer film out called Common Ground, which is just incredible. And Common Ground is is really amazing because they not only take you through the importance of regenerative farming and really how it can heal our earth and help with climate change, but they also really show us how these policies and how the funding is really affecting us in our food system right now. And they show how the makers of pesticides and herbicides, they're paying the funding for these universities. And so they really break it down and they show us just how deep this corruption goes and how so
Yeah.
much of the general public is in the dark about this because they are paying people to keep them in the dark.
I think that's right. And I think that the ground up notion is really key. And I think that is what has prompted some of these food companies to hire crisis management
Yep.
firms or online harassers or various other techniques because they're seeing that people are beginning to discover there's another way to eat. And that other way to eat benefits other companies, competitors of theirs. Organic wasn't a competitor of anyone 25 years ago. But now it's a kind of a serious threat and it carries this cultural weight. Well, you don't have to worry about food additives with organic because there are hardly any allowed in there. None of the ones that are allowed in conventional food are allowed in organic. The most toxic pesticides, people realize that some pesticides are used in organic, but they're pretty safe. They don't even have tolerances, legal limits at EPA for the most part. So I think it's threatening to the food system. And I love that energy. We like to think at EWG that we've been involved in the organic fight for a long time. My friend Phil Landrigan likes to say that organic is private school for food.
Yes.
It's great if you can find it, great if you can afford it, but not everyone can. But increasingly, it is becoming more available and more affordable. And that's super exciting. And it's an important alternative when you can go to our food scores database. You can line up organic versus conventional, and you just see the difference in the ingredient listing there. That's encouraging for people, right? And more companies are saying, I'm going to try that. I'm going to try organic, or I'm going to try and make something with fewer artificial ingredients. That direction, I think, is a challenge to the powers that be.
Yeah, it is. And like you said, they definitely are feeling threatened right now. You had mentioned them sending trolls online to attack people. I think that's a lot of what's happening right now too, as far as like the pushback that you and I are seeing online. Vani
Sure.
Hari very famously found these internal emails that were going back and forth between
Yep.
Monsanto, and they were specifically targeting certain people, and a lot of them were mothers that were speaking out about glyphosate and the various things that are in our food system, and they were creating troll farms to go and attack them online to try to get them to stop. And not only that, but they were also, if you think about, people are reading comments, and so they were creating all this confusion and chaos in the comments where people don't really know what to believe anymore.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. That's the strategy. And it's a defensive
Mhm.
posture from an industry that has been used to self-regulating, been used to having politicians under its control, been used to having regulators who would go out to lunch with them, but wouldn't regulate them
Exactly.
as they were supposed to be doing. So, yeah, I think that's right. And we would get calls at EWG about Vani and defend her because, we might have expressed things differently as a nonprofit than she did in her wonderful, direct way. But the overall direction we were pointing in was similar to hers, and we often took our lead from her. Her instinct, and I think that's an important part of this movement is you ought to literally trust your gut. If it seems artificial, if it seems ultra processed, if it seems like it's too good to be true, it
Probably is.
almost
Yeah.
certainly is. That is the hardest thing for a big food or big ag marketer to overcome is a parent or any person who just concludes, you know what? I'm going to try
Yeah.
something different.
Yeah, it is. There's been a very interesting shift. It depends on the day that you catch me on. It was dependent on how either hopeful or defeated I'm feeling, because there are some days where
Yeah.
I feel so incredibly hopeful. Like today, having this conversation with you, it just makes me so excited. It lights this fire under me that makes me feel like, okay, we're really making a difference. I mean, I've been looking at EWG for a long time. I told you this on my podcast that I've used you as a resource for I don't even know how many years now, and I've directed my audience to go, and what you have created has been just absolutely paramount to helping people figure out what's in their food and what's in
Oh,
their
thanks.
water. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. And so I'm so grateful and I'm so hopeful because there's so many people in this food fight, and we're all playing different roles that I think are so incredibly imperative to it. And then I have my days where it's really disheartening to see that there are a lot of people that are very stuck in an incredibly broken system, And when we think
Yeah.
about people that don't have access, or maybe don't have the funds or the resources to get the organic grass fed, and I think, this is where I speak to this a lot. For the people that do have the resources and the funds, it is imperative that for our humanity that we put our money into it for the people that can't right now, and be those voices for them, because the way I see it is that we're fighting for an accessible, healthy food system for everyone. That's my dream.
That's right.
A dream is that, everybody has access to organic food, clean food. I mean, I feel like it's a basic human right living on this planet.
I think that's right. I mean, we say at EWG, if we're not democratizing these things we're talking about, healthier ingredients in personal care products, in food, healthier food generally, if this is not becoming more accessible, more affordable, more available, if it isn't becoming the norm, then we're not interested in it. We're not interested in promoting these boutique elements of the culture, the food system that are accessible only to so-called elites. It's got to be real for everybody. Big food companies, for example, they want to really keep the highly processed, cheap food the forefront. And when you walk into a grocery store, that is sometimes for me the hardest,
I know.
the most defeating moment when I just walk in there, the bombardment of just the colors and the marketing and the words. You sort of think, well, how do we find our way out of it? But over time, I think with voices like yours, Courtney, and Vonnie and others, you're really making a difference. You're helping people find a path to healthier eating and healthier lives. And it's a form of resistance. It's a form of rebellion that I think is, it's important. It's not enough. We have to make sure people are carrying that rebellion and that sense of resistance beyond just what's coming in their grocery cart, but it's not unimportant.
Yeah, I agree. And everybody thinks that processed foods are inherently cheap. And I'm really trying to get this messaging out there because, well, there's a couple things happening. First and foremost, when you stop buying all these things in packages and you start buying whole, real, nutrient dense foods, you find that you don't eat as much and you're not buying as much food because you're more satisfied and you're not spending money on these bags of chips that, chips are not even that cheap anymore. It's like you buy a bag of chips
No,
for
that's right.
like $6 or $7, and then you get no nutrients out of it. You're not full. I mean, I could eat a whole meal after eating a bag of chips. So those essentially are these empty calories. And I'm not even talking about this from like a weight standpoint. I'm literally talking about this like if you're in dire straits poverty, you're going to want to put your money to the most use that you can with the most nutrient dense foods. And it's actually not these ultra processed foods that we've been brainwashed to think are cheaper. I actually did a series on my podcast that I'm hoping to reopen sometime soon with my producer. And we called it Organic for Everyone. And what we did is we went around to really popular fast food restaurants and we would buy a fast food meal. And then we'd also go to the grocery store, and we were going to super accessible grocery stores like Walmart, Target, Ralph's, Vons, like really accessible where most people have them. And we bought all the ingredients to make these fast food meals with organic ingredients, and we remade them. And then we would break down the cost and we would tell everybody in the podcast how much it cost. Now, there were a couple times where I was like, there's no way that we're going to be able to make this cheaper with all organic ingredients. Every single time, Ken, every single time we remade every single meal. And it was cheaper to go to the grocery store, buy it with all organic ingredients than it was to go through the fast food drive-through. So there's this misconception that it's cheap.
Yeah.
And people need to remember that initially it may be a little bit more upfront, right, at the cash register, but you're either going to pay for it upfront at the cash register or you are going to pay exponentially more, not only in money to the doctors, the surgeries, the medicine, but also in your health. And you can't take that back once you lose it.
Yeah, just your energy level
Exactly.
alone. But there is the one difference there. I'm curious to ask you about this. If you're not buying food that's ready to eat and processed to the fairly well, then you're
Yep.
cooking.
It's the time.
So how do you talk to people about that? I happen to like to cook, and so it comes easily to me. But to get people to do it, and I have to admit, I have my moments when I think, oh, I buy Amy's
Yeah.
frozen food, so I feel good about it. I've been to their plant. I've seen them make it. It's like cooking at large scale. It's, almost all organic ingredients and no meat and so forth. But the cooking thing is tough. And Michael Pollan wrote a whole book about it, right? He thinks that that's the solution is gardening and cooking. So are you the cook in the household?
I am. My boyfriend likes to cook a little bit here and there, but when we moved in together and after he realized how much he liked my cooking, he's kind of like taking a back seat and he's like, I'm going to let you do this because I think you're a better cook than I am.
Yeah.
So I do the majority of the cooking in the household, but I find joy in it, just like you. I genuinely love it. I would say, I think a lot of people initially are scared because they think they're going to be really bad or they think it's going to be really hard. I would say 95% of the meals that I make are so incredibly easy. Like I'm not expecting anyone to go in there and do a 5-course Martha Stewart type meal. It's like you can make it really simple. We live in an amazing time where you have so many resources. I think almost every single person at least has a phone. And you can go to YouTube, you can go to Instagram, and you can find really simple tutorials.
You can learn.
Exactly. Learn how to
Yeah.
do it. And know that in the beginning, if you're nervous and scared, you probably are going to mess up. I can't tell you how many bad meals I've made and been like, oof, okay, we're going to have to work on that one or we're not going to make that again. And it can be something as simple as just frying up some eggs, fry up some eggs, get some really
Yeah.
good sourdough toast, put some butter and avocado on it. And that's it. That's a meal.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be something we have to overthink. I would hope that most people listening have at least one person in their household that likes to cook, I would hope. If not, I would say, find your workarounds, because unfortunately, the reality is that everybody's gonna have to make their peace with this at some point, is that we are living in a time that if you don't make time for your wellness, you will have to make time for your illness. It just is the time and place that we live in right now. So it is incredibly important. And however way you do that, whether it's if you have the resources and the money to buy, the Amy's frozen stuff and buy more of the pre-made stuff that's made with more ingredients. And I said in the very beginning, you could use that as like a framework to read the ingredients and say like, okay,
Yeah.
this is healthy. I think Amy's is a great option. You can buy canned soups. You can buy boxed various meals that you can make that are just made with really simple ingredients. Those do exist now. So I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
workarounds.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, like I said, we all have to get more serious about this, or we will have to make time for getting sick. It just is the reality of the time we live in.
I think we'll close on that brilliant observation. Make time for wellness or make time for illness. It's your
Yeah.
choice. My advice is to follow Courtney Swan, because that's an important path, an enjoyable path, an exciting path, I think, to learn about wellness as it comes to us through this key ingredient of what we eat and how we eat it and when. Court, thank you so much for spending time. I look forward to hanging out with you soon. And I'm delighted that we were able to have this conversation.
Me too. I'm so grateful for being asked on, and I hope we can have a dinner soon and we'll scare everybody else away.
Let's do that. Yeah. No one else will want to join us, but that's okay. We'll be good. We'll be good.
We'll be great. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney Swan, for coming on the show. And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links to take a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, I hope you are, head on over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. Now, if you like this episode, send it to a friend who you think would like it too. Environmentalism is all about meeting people where they're at. And if you're listening to this, you probably know someone who might be interested in today's episode. They just don't know it yet. My ask is that you send it to that person or as many people as you see fit. Today's episode was produced by the remarkable Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by Moby. Thank you. And thanks all of you out there again for listening.